Greetings from Seattle, Washington. I'm John Crusius. Today I want to talk to you about a dissolved iron flux to the Gulf of Alaska that is derived from Alaskan glacial dust that isn't resolved by dust transport models. This is work that was recently published in JGR Biogeosciences. Okay, a bit of an outline. I'm going to tell you that dissolved iron limits primary productivity in the subarctic North Pacific, but we lack a quantitative understanding of the iron sources. In this work, I'm going to revisit previously published time series observations of dissolved iron from the central Gulf of Alaska. Some very nice previously published work. I hope to convince you and show you that there are increases in the dissolved iron inventory, in other words, the amount of iron in terms of millimoles iron per meter squared during the fall and winter in 2 successive years, and that this implies there's a dissolved iron source at that time. I can virtually rule out dissolved iron inputs from Asian dust, Haida eddies, advection, forest fires, fossil fuels, and upwelling during that time frame. But this fall-winter dissolved iron source is consistent with input from Alaskan glacial dust. I hope to convince you also that global dust models today lack the spatial resolution to simulate this dust from Alaskan sources. It's because of the narrow river valleys from which the dust emanates, which raises the question, are we underestimating other sources of dust to the ocean? Okay, a bit of background. Iron is a micronutrient that limits phytoplankton growth, primary productivity, in about 40% of the surface of the ocean. So this is an image that shows the nitrate concentrations in surface waters, and pink is really low nitrate concentrations, yellow, green, and blue are much higher. And you can see that in most of the ocean, iron nitrate concentrations are very, very low, but in the Southern Ocean and in the subarctic Pacific Ocean and other places, the nitrate is never fully consumed. Well, we've learned over the last 20, 30 years that this is because iron limits phytoplankton growth in those parts of the ocean. All right, historically, we've tended to think that this iron to the subarctic North Pacific comes from these deserts in Central and Eastern Asia. So these are the dust source areas that supply this dust to the subarctic North Pacific, and I'm referring specifically to the Gobi Desert, the Taklamakan Desert, and others. So today I'm going to present mostly information from Ocean Station Papa, which I'll abbreviate as OSP. Ocean Station Papa is a site that's been studied quite a bit by the Canadians over many decades. It's located at 50 degrees north, 145 degrees west, indicated by the star. And you can see that it's many hundreds of kilometers away from any coastline. So I'm going to revisit these data published by Nishioka in 2001. It's a very beautiful data set, time series, dissolved iron data from OSP. The first sample collection was in September 1997. There were four other collection periods extending through February of 1999. Here I'm showing the individual profiles that were collected, and I'm showing this just to convey the notion that these all look like reasonable profiles with classical nutrient behavior, somewhat depleted at surface, although not entirely depleted, but enriched as you go deeper in the ocean in all 5 of these. If you superimpose them on top of each other and try to convey some seasonality, as I'm doing here, you see that there's increases over time. So I'm showing on the left dissolved iron concentrations in September 1997 as well as February 1998. And on the right I'm showing dissolved iron concentrations in June 98, September 1998, and February 1999. The main point I want to make here is that from September of one year to February of the following year, 5 months, there's an increase each time and each year of dissolved iron concentrations. In the first year, it's about 80 micromoles per meter squared. That's a 33% increase. The second year, it's a 250 micromole per meter squared increase, about a 70% increase. Now, interestingly, this increase is very similar to the published dissolved iron fluxes from dust from previous work, including work by Chris Hayes and Bob Anderson et al. From 2013, and some work that I published in 2017 as well. All right, what are some of these possible sources of iron at this time? I'm assuming that this increase in the autumn and winter is indicative of a source at that time. I'm going to go through some of these possibilities. I'm going to rule out several possibilities. So could upwelling be a source? Well, at that same time, conveniently, Nishioka measured nitrate concentrations, and the nitrate inventories only increased by about 3% over that time frame each year. So in other words, the iron concentrations increased by 30% and 70%, whereas nitrate only increases 3%. So if we assumed that the increase in iron was due to upwelling, you'd assume the nitrate would increase similarly, and it doesn't. So we can rule out upwelling. Okay, Haida eddies. First of all, what are Haida eddies? They are eddies that transport coastal material from the British Columbia coast westward. It's from the coast of Haida Gwaii Islands, Queen Charlotte Islands. That material is transported westward over a time scale of a year or more. Well, the strongest evidence against that is the observations from Whitney and Robert in 2002. There's about 2 of these eddies per year, a little less, but Whitney and Robert tracked 9 such eddies in detail over a period of several years. Only one of them transported iron as far west as OSP. It took about 3.5 years to get there, and it arrived in June. So yes, the Haida eddies are a source of iron, but no, they're probably not an annual source, and they're also not necessarily a source that delivers iron in the fall and winter consistently. Okay, Asian dust. I already mentioned that briefly. We know that this source peaks in the spring. Some nice work by Umatsu et al. And Deuce and others. There's no evidence, however, of significant flux of Asian dust in the fall and winter. Forest fires. There's some nice work by Christina Schallenberg and Jay Cullenberg from 2017 that argued that yes, in fact, forest fires can be a significant source of iron to the Ocean Station Papa region. But they observed that in the summertime. That would be a lot less likely in the fall or winter when we see these increases of iron, and also less likely in the late 90s compared to the present, owing to likely increases in fire frequency from climate change. Okay, fossil fuel combustion. There's been a lot of work recently suggesting that fossil fuel combustion can be a source of iron. However, recall that these observations that I'm showing are from the late 90s, and fossil fuel combustion from China at that time was about 3 times lower than at present. So while we can't entirely rule this out as a source, it seems less likely that it was a significant source back in 1998 than at present. Okay, advection from the coast. There's some nice glider data by Pelland et al. From 2016. Showed 18 months of data which showed currents almost entirely from the south and the east, they looked at currents from the surface as deep as 700 meters, and they're primarily from the south and the east. So that raises the question of whether there could be a source of iron from the British Columbia coast. The data from Nishioka et al. Argues there's not a lot of iron that makes it past the shelf break along line P, extending out from the British Columbia coast. And there's other data suggesting there's not much sedimentary iron that gets past the Gulf of Alaska shelf break either. So while we can't entirely rule this out, it seems unlikely. Okay, so that leaves Alaskan dust as a strong candidate for this source of iron in the fall and winter of the Gulf of Alaska. So with this, I revisit some old data, some old publications of mine, and also acknowledge that Phil Boyd was probably the first person, or might have been the first person back in 1998, to suggest that Alaskan dust could be a source of iron to this region. But this image that I'm showing now is a satellite image from the northern Gulf of Alaska region. You can see the scale at the top showing 100 kilometers scale. And mostly this is an image of dust transport from the Copper River, which is the single biggest source of dust to the Gulf of Alaska. And you can see that dust is being transported several hundred, maybe 500 kilometers offshore. But it's not just the Copper River, it's also coming from the Yakutat Bay region, from the Alaskan River region, and to the west from a region just west of Kodiak Island as well. So there's multiple regions simultaneously transporting iron at that time. And that peaks in the it peaks in the autumn almost every year. So again, let's come back to these data from Nishioka. You're going to say, well, how can this be dust? Because the increases are subsurface primarily, although there's a little bit of increase at the surface. Well, for this explanation, we go to the literature on thorium. Thorium's use as a dust tracer. And there's a nice work by Chris Hayes and Bob Anderson et al. From 2013, where they say that the delivery mechanism of dissolved thorium from dust dissolution is relatively complex, possibly involving rapid export of colloidal thorium and its subsequent regeneration or disaggregation within 500 to 1,000 meters below the sea surface. So thorium and iron behave relatively similar in terms of their abiological or non-biological behavior. So we can assume that iron probably behaves similarly to thorium in that respect. Okay, so why Alaskan dust in the autumn? What is the mechanism? I'm just going to revisit this for those who aren't familiar with that past work. It's simply because these are glacier-dominated rivers that peak and discharge in the summer, and then the river discharge decreases tremendously in the fall and winter. And what I'm showing you are images of the Copper River floodplain. On the left, you can see an image of Andrew Schroth standing next to the Copper River, and you can see how the river level is several meters lower in October 2009 when this image was taken than it was in the peak summer discharge period. So the river levels drop. In the autumn, there's little or no snow. You have these massive floodplains of exposed sediments, and there's this tremendous amount of aerosol source material that can be channeled down these mountain river valleys by strong winds. And that's the process that happens in the fall and winter in southern Alaska. Okay, for this work, I'm going to present wind data, offshore wind data from the NASA QuickScat satellite. We actually tried to measure winds using an anemometer, but we broke that anemometer within the river valley. So shifted to trying to estimate wind speeds offshore using this NASA QuickScat satellite. Now uses a scatterometer. The scatterometer emits microwave radiation, and it estimates wind speed and direction from the power reflected back from the sea surface as roughened by the wind. So this device gave a daily snapshot at 25 kilometer resolution, but only 15 kilometers and more from the coast. So these are estimates of wind speeds and direction over the ocean, but they greatly underestimate the wind speeds at the dust source, which is in the river valleys on land. And this NASA mission only extended until 2009, so I'm only going to show wind speed and direction data from this period of the NASA mission. And I'm not going to present ASCAT wind speed observations for reasons I don't have time to get into. Okay, so complicated image here, but on the top of this image I'm showing wind speed and direction. The wind speeds are being conveyed as vectors. So the direction of the arrow points in the direction the wind is blowing in, and the length of the vector gives a measure of the wind speed. And you can see that there's offshore winds blowing at multiple sites that coincide with places where there's dust visible in these images. Now, the largest amount of dust is from the Copper River Valley, which is site B here. It's not the site of strongest winds, but it is the site of the largest amount of glacial material transported, because this is a really large river that discharges to the Gulf of Alaska. There's also a little bit of dust coming from near Kodiak, where there's really strong winds to the west, but other sites as well. And I want to also draw your attention to site C here, which is a site blocked by high mountains to the north. High mountains to the north block the winds, and sure enough, you don't see any winds, you don't see any dust being transported from that site either. So the point of this image is just to point out that the dust discharge aligns with these sites of strong winds blowing offshore. Offshore means different directions and different locations. All right, I'm going to present an image of a time series of just the winds now. Okay, here's the winds. Again, I'm going to draw your attention primarily to this Copper River region, which is just south of this Green River Valley. You can see the winds blowing offshore there in orange and red. I'm going to show 7 days, 7 daily snapshots of the wind, and you're going to see that the wind is consistently from the north, blowing towards the south and a little bit to the west, coming out of the Copper River Valley. So there's day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So these are highly anomalous winds, but they're consistently blowing to the south, and they're transporting dust over an extended period of time. Okay, another image from 2009 conveying the same idea that there's dust transport out of the Copper River and also the Alaskan River to the west, to the east, sorry. I don't have time to go into this, but the big events, this is air temperature and humidity data from this region. And the take-home message here is that during big events, air temperatures are well below freezing, about -10 to -15 degrees, also very dry and kind of sustained. Minor events have temperatures closer to freezing. So it really takes temperatures well below freezing to cause this kind of strong, large, major dust event. I don't have time to explain that in greater detail. Okay, so global dust models lack the spatial resolution needed to simulate this dust. The Copper River Valley is only 1 to 10 kilometers wide. It's a source of dust. CMEP5 dust models, on the other hand, have resolution of about 0.75 to 3 degrees, which translates to 40 to 60 kilometers at 6 degrees north. So this model resolution is too coarse by at least an order of magnitude. And this is consistent with observations from Greenland, where model resolution of 60 kilometers underestimated the wind speeds by 10 to 20 meters per second. And that was work by Oltmans et al. 2015, which begs the question of where else are we failing to model dust transport? Okay, I'm going to jump to conclusions. Hope that I convinced you that in the fall and winter, the increases in dissolved iron at Ocean Station Papa are consistent with input from Alaskan glacial dust. This Alaskan dust is derived from strong offshore winds from glaciarized river valleys through narrow mountain gaps. I can virtually rule out Asian dust, Haida eddies, advection from the coast, and fossil fuel combustion, forest fires, and upwelling as sources of dissolved iron at that time. Global dust models lack the spatial resolution to simulate this dust, and it raises the question of where else are we missing important dust sources. If correct, this Alaskan dust is impacting dissolved iron 1,100 kilometers from the coast, which is more than twice as far as it's been inferred by eye from satellites. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.